I will go ahead and get us started. I still see that we've still got people filtering in, but we're just gonna get rolling and people can come in as they arrive. So thanks everyone so much for being here today. I'm Emily Torty. I work for Appalachian Sustainable Development, and we have Jonathan McRay with us today hosting this session as a guest host. I'm really excited to have him here. I'll introduce him a little more in a minute, and then we've also got Rhiannon and Elodie here, and Jonathan's going to be introducing them in turn further shortly as well. So before all that, just a quick introduction. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks again for being here. I know everybody's got busy schedules. I hope that you can enjoy a break in what is a rainy day here and across the region. So maybe that push to be indoors and enjoying the dryness inside will bring us together in a nice way today. But I want to nod to the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation, whose funding makes this program possible. And in particular, we're just really grateful for that specific sort of bucket of funding that we're working with. It's really flexible and gives us, we have a lot of guidance, but like also gives us a good amount of autonomy to do stuff like this, which is really great, especially in the specific landscape of like federal funding crises that we're facing right now. So thank you, EMEF. And there we go. And thanks again to Steve Gabriel and Jonathan McRay for helping out this season. They've been guest hosting and bringing some really interesting folks into the spotlight and doing some excellent uplifting work. So thanks for being here. And if y'all aren't familiar, check out the Farming with Trees Collective. We'll drop the website in the chat in a little bit and you can check them out. So right now we're in the welcome space. I'm just going to talk a little bit about webinar controls, talk a little bit about ASD, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan. And he's going to talk about the project they've been working on and get speaking with our wonderful guests. And then we'll do our Q&A. So just a reminder, we are recording this webinar. These will upload to YouTube. The first two sessions of this season should get uploaded, I think, later this week or early next week. And then I hope to have these last two listening sessions recorded and processed and turn around within a week or so of today. If you need closed captioning, really useful. You can just click the little CC button. Those will auto-generate. They're not going to always be 100% correct because it is an AI feature, but they're really useful, even if you're just in a loud space or if you like to have a little visual cue to help you like stay engaged and follow along. Those are really great. So that's an excellent feature. If you want to ask a question of somebody today, please use the Q&A. The chat feature is there pretty much just for chatting, for casual talk, for sharing links. If you actually want your question to be addressed by the panelists today, please put it in the Q&A, and that's how we'll work through those. A little bit about ASD. Our mission is to build a thriving regional food and agriculture system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. We have been around for 30 years. We're having a 30-year birthday this year, which is pretty exciting. And we do a lot of different work. These are sort of the main 5 categories. We have a strong workforce development program where we train folks with barriers to employment, primarily substance abuse and prior incarceration, into agricultural vocations. So we have a agroforestry nursery track for that that's new this year. It's really exciting. We also have tracks where folks can work in, food processing, food hub situation. We have like CDL and forklift certification, that kind of stuff, and even a food truck track. So a lot of different food and ag opportunities there. We do all kinds of agriculture education. My dog is barking in the background. We do all kinds of ag education work with schools, with hospitals, with the general public. We also do a lot of food access stuff. We have a free food box program that goes out from our Duffield location in far southwestern Virginia and goes up and down 81 a little ways. And we give out a lot of free food on a weekly basis, sourced from farmers in the region. We have an economic development branch of what we do, where we're working with folks on business planning and business training. And then we also have resources management, which is where agroforestry falls. So we do a lot of work in different, conservation buckets, and we do obviously a lot of agroforestry outreach, education, training of natural resources professionals, and all kinds of stuff. So just a little intro to us and what we do. If you want to learn more, please go to the ASD website. You can click on the program tab. It looks a little different than this right now, but structured mostly the same. You can go to programs, agroforestry, and see what we're about. Thanks again for tuning in this spring. If you didn't catch some of the earlier sessions, this is what we've been up to, and those will all be online on the YouTube playlist shortly. And I think this is our 23rd session, maybe. I don't know. The playlist is getting long and rich. It's very exciting. So definitely check those out, and you can do the little like subscribe thing, so it lets you know when a new one gets downloaded. First, I need to launch a poll really quick. Let's see. Polls launch. Please, if you don't mind, please take a second to answer our poll. It it helps us with our grant reporting metrics. We've got to keep our funders happy, and we have to report back on who we're reaching. So it's actually really valuable for us. I'm going to go ahead and leave it up while I hand it over to Jonathan, and we'll leave that up for a few minutes so you can enter that information. But thanks again. So happy to have you here. Jonathan McRay, I'm so excited to be working with you again on Ask An Agroforester. Had a really great session. I think the first year I was doing the program, and we talked all about Silver Run Forest Farm and your nursery. And I was just thinking about it the other day. That was one of my favorite sessions. And then yesterday I was sending an email where I was trying to introduce you to a colleague and try, you know how you try to like recap like what someone is or does. And I was like, I don't even like, I'm not even sure how to cover all these things. I was like, social justice and equity and agroforestry and the nursery and facilitation and conflict navigation. And I was like, I actually went back and I was like, I'm just going to say less because they'll figure it out. Like they'll have an introduction on their own. But all that to say, Jonathan's great. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over, but thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for that, Emily. Great to be here again. Thanks for inviting Steve and me, and also Sophia a couple weeks ago to host one about multi-generational land stewardship. That all feels like part of this theme that we're talking about: long-term, deeply rooted, perennially rich, and like people-focused agricultural systems. So it's really exciting to be part of this. And thanks to Rhiannon and Elodie for saying yes to jump on this call too. But I'm Jonathan McRay. I'm in the Shenandoah Valley right now in Virginia, where we just got a whole bunch of rain, which feels really relieving. But I'm a co-operator of Silver Run Forest Farm, which is a agroforestry nursery that we like to talk about as cultivating and celebrating tree crops and plant allies that cross-pollinate food sovereignty and ecological restoration, because we don't have to choose between feeding the earth and feeding humans. We could do both. And food sovereignty is a phrase and a concept and like political vision that comes from the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, or the peasant path, that we get a lot of direction from and learn from. And then want to introduce these awesome participatory guests, Rhiannon and Elodie. If y'all are willing to say your name and location and your nursery or your relationship to tree crops.
You said Rhiannon first, so I'll jump in. My name's Rhiannon Wright. My nursery is called the Forest Exchange. My partner, Cameron Wygant, and I co-own that. We're in Delaware County, New York, which is the one of the northernmost Appalachian counties. We are technically still in Appalachia here. So I'm sure there's lots of folks who join from more northern and southern counties than ASD's like core zone. So yeah, we're happy to be here in the Catskills at the headwaters of the Susquehanna watershed. The nursery we call ourselves an agroforestry nursery. So we're all focused on, for us, that, encapsulates food producing plants, habitat creation, climate resilience, and we love woody plants. So we're doing trees and shrubs mostly. Um, I am also on the leadership team of the Catskills Young Farmers, to the local chapter of the National Young Farmers Coalition, and the West Branch Commons, which is a community land trust agrarian commons project happening here in Delaware County. So I'm very group project flavored. I love a group project, and that's why I was so excited and drawn to this Farming with Trees project. So thank you so much for having me. There's been a lot of like my mentors have been featured on this series, so I'm really glad and honored to be speaking today.
Hi everyone, I am Elodie. I am based in Western Massachusetts, and have been in the tree crops world for almost a decade now. And I've worked at several different nurseries. I started off as kind of like an apprenticeship at Twisted Tree Farm outside of Ithaca. I also worked at Arthur's Point Farm, agroforestry nursery in the Hudson Valley, and I've also worked with Yellow Bud Farm, nursery based in Western Massachusetts. I'm currently not at the moment working at a nursery, but I am deepening my tree evaluation work, which is really exciting. I have a grant from the Northern Nut Growers Association, of which now I'm also a board member, um, to do evaluation and GPS mapping at the Sleeping Giant Orchard, which is the oldest chestnut genetic repository in the country, and it's been really cool to work on that project. Right now, I'm based in Western Mass, but I'm actually at Bread Tree Farms in New York, which is a larger scale agroforestry farm that's primarily chestnut based, and they're also incorporating silvopasture. Um, and yeah, I also work with Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative based in Pennsylvania. So I'm involved in a lot of things, and over the years have touch base with Jonathan McRay, and just to have various check-ins about different things. And it's been cool to connect with Farming with Trees recently, also with Stephen. And yeah, happy to be here and to share whatever I can. So thanks for having me.
Beautiful. Thanks, y'all. This is it feels really exciting to have this conversation here and pull this into the Ask an Agroforester. Emily mentioned I was on here a couple of years ago, as an interviewee, and then just in y'all's introductions, named so many people that have been on this webinar series. So check it out on YouTube. It's a really incredible resource, this webinar. There's so much good stuff. And we'll touch on some of those things today in the conversation. But I'm going to do a little bit just to give a map of what we're expecting for the next little over an hour. I'm going to give a little bit of overview of the project, why we're doing this, some of the things that we heard in these interview sessions that we did with nursery folks, and then I'll open up a conversation with Rhiannon and Elodie, given their participation in the interviews that we did last year, and have sort of like a live version of some of that interview, and then open it up to questions and conversations y'all might have who are here in the webinar. But Steve did a lot of this intro last week about the Farming with Trees collective. It's had multiple different emphases. I won't go into tons of detail on that. Once the YouTube video is up, then you can see more about that. But the Farming with Trees Collective is a decentralized effort of just some kindred spirits who love tree crops and see a need to coordinate some things more, to educate in different ways, to pull together research. Steve Gabriel and I go back about 8 years now to when I was living in the woods that he and his partner Liza tend up in the Finger Lakes at Wellspring Forest Farm, where I was working on their mushrooms and sheep silvopasture and in their sugar bush in the maple grove, and came really close to them and just started scheming and dreaming as people who were really excited about agroforestry rooted in communities and in cooperative economies and ways that actually feed and sustain people. And we wanted to see more coordinated and collaborative approaches to agroforestry, that cooperatives and alliances, like agrarian alliances and all this kind of stuff, multi-generational land stewardship, these are so common. Interestingly, like in conventional ag, in the US, but also in so-called alternative or sustainable agriculture around the world. But it's not as widespread or common to talk about that stuff in sustainable agriculture in the US, which has kind of attached itself in many ways to a pretty pioneer, like little house on the prairie mentality and model that isn't actually very good history of the US. And there's so much history of farmer co-ops and unions in the US over the last 150 years, but we're just not applying those learnings or those practices to the field of agroforestry in the same way. But there's so much good work happening with tree crops, agroforestry, with nurseries. So how do we coordinate it and focus it a little bit more? And some of this was arising from conversations Steve and I were having with some other friends who have been involved of the impression that you might get from mainstream reports on climate change is that trees will do anything. Like trees are the answer to everything. Like they could sequester all the carbon since the Industrial Revolution, so we can just keep pumping out more. And they could clean polluted water and air, and they could replace annual crops, and they could even grow jobs and like gender equity and all this kind of stuff. And there's just some overinflated claims of trees uprooted from their context. And Steve said this last week that large scale tree plantings that align with these stories in the mainstream news about climate and the role of trees in that large scale tree plantings have often failed for a variety of reasons. One is wrong location. Another one is wrong species. Another one is that there's been little monitoring and evaluating in the aftermath of planting, and that the decisions on how to do that have often been pretty top down and like divorced from the people that the projects are supposedly meant to serve. And there's also new forestry research over the last few years that shows a pretty overwhelming scarcity of tree seedlings in the United States. The available stock often isn't sourced appropriately, which means the trees aren't locally adapted to geography and to season. There was one report in particular from 2021 that concluded that US nurseries need to double tree seedlings to meet projected requirements for reforestation and carbon sequestration. Like double is a lot. And those numbers don't directly address agroforestry. Reforestation and afforestation through agroforestry are different things. But what I think it does clarify that does feel relevant is that massive monoculture tree plantings often really don't work, and that quantity of seedlings and the quality of those seedlings really matter. So this project of farming with trees and our interviews and listening sessions really came from a desire to think about a more transformative way to plant trees and tree crops that sees maybe the forest along with the trees, that sees the whole ecosystem instead of just the individuals, that we want to address root causes from the local to the global. We think a transformative approach would stem from clear goals, coordinated with very attentive care, making sure people are supported in the work of planting and protecting trees, and that it would include people in the processes that affect them. It would include people in the decisions so they can participate in making the decisions that affect their lives. So we did what a lot of folks do who want to do more collaborative research, as we applied for a SARE grant, the Northeast SARE grant. So thanks to that, which has been really amazing to draw more in our approach from disciplines and practices like popular education, as a term that comes out of a radical Brazilian educator context, Paulo Freire, among others, who see education as a process of drawing out, not just filling in knowledge, but drawing out from the lived experience of people and finding the patterns that connect the issues that we're facing, and then find the themes, find the connections in the patterns of our lives, and then come up with action plans that then we reflect on and then act again and reflect on, and that there's always a learning and a teaching involved in everybody's participation, and a very participatory action research. We're not just researching just to have more research. We're researching to do something with it. We want to change some things. And then learning from farmer to farmer movements in the global South and in the US South in particular. Along with farming, I'm a facilitator and a mediator and organize in a lot of grassroots formations. And we wanted to align those a little bit more and see the connections with those. So last week, on this webinar, Steve shared what's happening in the farmer listening sessions and the interviews that we've been doing. But as we started this project, which was like, let's listen to farmers, let's see what the needs are. What are people excited about doing with trees? What feel like the challenges? And then what are possible solutions, possible steps we could take to support people? We started realizing we should also talk to nursery growers. We should talk to the supply side of agroforestry, the propagation and cultivation of the tree crops themselves. So I added a new focus that actually wasn't there at the beginning of this grant project because it felt so crucial that maybe we need to scale up tree nurseries rather than simply scale up tree plantings. So we selected a list of nurseries, small to mid-sized, and some pretty big ones that we invited for conversation about species, about scale, and about cooperative structures to make agroforestry more effective and more rooted long term. And one major outcome of those listening sessions will be a publicly available summary that we'll post on the Farming with Trees website and hopefully some other places, but also hopes to organize propagators and planters into more collaborative structures. And that Steve shared about that last week too. That's becoming the Mycena Agroforestry Initiative. So there are a lot of hopefully practical outcomes. I'm going to share my screen for just a minute to show you some of the questions that we asked and the summary that came out of that both Rhiannon and Cameron, Rhiannon's partner, and then Elodie participated in, and then we'll have more conversation from there. Cool. It's a very boring Google Doc, so I'm not going to read through the whole thing. Boring just in visual. It's pretty awesome, the stuff that's in it. I'm very excited about it. But we'll post this later, but I just wanted to show a couple of the details from this is that last year, Farming with Trees, we conducted interviews with 14 nursery growers and 9 different interviews ranging from New York to Virginia. And we had a list of questions. The interviews ranged in length, and we had a list of questions that just snowballed, as the conversation took on a life of its own. We just followed where it went. But we wanted to know about why people had been excited to start a nursery and how do you talk about your nursery? What story do you tell? What Rhiannon and Elodie just did a few minutes ago is how do you describe what you're doing and the connection to agroforestry? What are things you wish you knew more when you started? What species are you most excited about? And then what are strategies that you think are best suited to address the shortage of seedlings in both quantity and quality that I just talked about? What are strategies to address that? And how do you see the role of scale in an ecological nursery? What's missing in the conversation? So all these different questions. And then we found themes through all that. Some of those themes where I'll show you were like the purpose of the nursery, the species that people are excited about, the role of scale, context and change, the social, political, and economic context that people are operating in, and what kinds of changes people thought needed to happen to support agroforestry more. Finances, like actual money flowing through the system to make this possible. What were the themes people were seeing? So we had multiple things like that. But I want to read very briefly this summary. This is the summary of all the stuff that came out that felt like the synthesis, the themes that resonated the most with the most people that we talked to that give, in my opinion, something of a common ground and maybe some action steps for people to take, not just a report, but actually something to do with it. So here's a little bit from that. As we heard from people, agroforestry is disorganized despite growing interest. This number of small nurseries focused on supplying agroforestry has blossomed in the past few years, but those numbers aren't enough for the necessary quantity and quality of seedlings. Public and private plans involve planting millions of trees in the next 10 to 25 years, but the nurseries to grow that many trees don't exist. So instead of thinking of agroforestry as just a farming enterprise for tree crops, can we treat it more like a social movement? Agroforestry doesn't just require technical service providers, though they're awesome. It also needs a coordinated action plan. The nurseries represented in the synthesis aren't all trying to do the same things, and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. They operate at various financial and production scales, but these propagators and researchers are all tree crop lovers, excited about a fruitful and abundant, people-centered perennial agriculture that provides basic human needs, from flour and oil to the support trees providing mulch, nitrogen, and pollen. However, cultivating an agriculture, whether that's perennial or annual, that meaningfully feeds people can't depend on idealistic volunteers. It requires an economy that supports people passionate about agroforestry and ready to commit decades to it. More people could thrive in agroforestry if they were supported by a network designed to help them succeed. A lot of these nurseries are focused on specialty tree crops, but that can provide a decent income, but they have a limited customer base and require major marketing. Bare root trees are constrained by season and customer desire for pots, and only rich people can afford to buy the incredible amount of plants necessary for a functioning agro ecosystem that's not just a backyard thing. Small nurseries attempting to store, pack, and ship trees at scale compete with larger nurseries with more financial backing and heavy chemical use, which is one of the participants said is like trying to enter the wholesale lettuce market with your backyard garden. The problem of affordable available trees might not just be the numbers. The problem is also a bottleneck of missed connections, from the hodgepodge of seed sources to the absence of shared standards, along with relational tensions stemming from these realities. In our current system, lots of money and land through investment or inheritance are usually necessary to make significant scale work, which bottlenecks widespread agroforestry adoption to the most economically and socially advantaged in the status quo system, which is a small number of white people. Gate-kept bottlenecks of access, resources, and unresolved conflict make it incredibly hard for agroforestry to create necessary intergenerational relationships and systems. And yet, small tweaks could open up room for some leverage. If the bottleneck for quality and quantity trees is missed or misused connections, then cooperation and collaboration are necessary to ease the flow of financial challenges and the disorganization of agroforestry. Creating cooperative paths for regional producers can lower the barrier for entry into agroforestry and make it possible to adopt practices that seem risky in isolation. Such paths could take multiple directions. Some people talked about hub and spoke models that involve lots of independent sibling organizations that set standards and organize sales and shipping together. Some people talked about single landscape level, like big entities that kind of operate as a network of cooperative companies that own some equity in that parent entity. Lots of different options, but ultimately, whatever shape the cooperative path takes, it involves several things that came up over and over again: sharing genetic resources, sharing information, and the absolute need for genetic repositories. Not just collaborative organizations for selection and distribution, but we got to create long-term community-owned seed orchards and repositories so that, as Elodie said, nobody owns the trees. The trees are always for everyone. What elements would characterize agroforestry nurseries committed to this vision? We were asking people, like, what are character traits, or elements of a nursery that would be committed to doing this? The scale of agroforestry focused nurseries can stretch over this huge wide spectrum, from big conservation style wholesale nurseries with organic practices like Yellowbud. And you can check out the interview that they had on this webinar, to networks of small backyard nurseries that could aggregate together. Such efforts won't align on everything, but what could they share? What common ground could they have? And in particular, what would a nursery of whatever size look like when committed to ecological principles and to economic justice? And some of the themes that we heard that hopefully can be developed over time is that these nurseries could find common ground if they were committed to feeding the soil with outrageous diversity, is what one person said. If they selected for abundance and diversity, lots of food, lots of nectar, lots of nitrogen, whatever, and diverse relationships, that they could share standards for growing and grading tree seeds and seedlings, that they structured their work with fairness, that people are compensated well, have equity, whatever it is that is the right, just, and appropriate compensation for the work, with a long-term vision, multi-generational vision, and that they respect the plants. The plants are seen as living beings that we are partnering with, and not just commodities that we're selling, and that we make them accessible. We find some ways to make them more accessible and available to people. So that's a lot of stuff to share as a introduction to the kinds of things that we were hearing in these themes that hopefully we're going to keep developing with folks. But Rhiannon and Cameron from the Forest Exchange, and Elodie all participated in this. So I want to open this up now for conversation, and ask y'all, maybe first, why did you say yes to doing this interview last year? What was the impetus for collaborating, and how'd you feel about the experience? We had some conversations at multiple points, but then a more focused interview. So why did you say yes, and how did it feel to do that and have this kind of conversation? And either one of you feel free to take it and we'll just chat.
Happy to start. I've said this in my intro, but I love a group project. I'm very interested in cooperative organizing, and we're really lucky here in the Catskills to have a super robust farmer network. There's a really great multi-farm CSA project here called the 607 CSA, and now the Catskills Agrarian Alliance that I think just being able to look around the landscape and see all of these existing cooperative networks of farmers and see how they are getting it done. They are like more so than any other category of farmers, including, I think, like bankrolled investment trust fund projects that people are doing. Um, so I think the seeing the opportunity to make that happen for or get the wheels turning for nursery folks is really exciting. I think the agroforestry as a new the oldest, I guess it is the oldest way of farming, but for our generation of younger farmers, really bringing it back into the fold in a production kind of framework. We're just behind where like the organic movement is for veg or for meat, all of those like existing pathways for the aggregation, cooperation, information sharing. Yeah, we need it needs to be done. So I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation. What about you, Elodie?
Um, well, I feel like I could say so many things. It was so cool to see that summary. I think the place where I'll start is that like it really resonated in the summary talking about tree crops and agroforestry as a social movement, because that's how it's always felt to me and how I've always oriented towards it. And I guess just to give a little bit of context of like my experience in within that world is that like even just like 5 years ago, it was such a different world. It was so small. And like there's this event that used to happen at Twisted Tree Farm called the Nut Bonanza where like I met Jonathan years and years ago and so many other people that I work with now who are like all spread out all over the place, and now there's all these other people coming in the fold. But anyway, it the beginnings of it have felt like just people being so passionate about it and wanting to work together. And that's just the interactions of the younger farmers. And then also, as I've spoken to people, like, for example, chestnut growers or Ohio, or like other various folks who've been working with these crops for decades and decades, who I've met through the Northern Nut Growers Association, they are so generous with their experience and their knowledge. And when you offer them compensation or even just like thanking them for their time and sharing, they always say the same thing, which is that someone else did the same thing for me and got me started. So there is a really strong culture of generosity and sharing, that I think is so important for us to continue as much as we can, because there are so many bottlenecks and challenges in all of this, is that we have to work together as much as we can. And it's so cool to have, even though we might have different theories of change or different angles that we think we want to contribute towards this work, it's like ultimately our shared vision is pretty similar. And I think that that's like a really strong strength. And I think of it more as a community than an industry. I do. So I think that's probably why I wanted to participate, because it's a great opportunity to continue that culture. Yeah.
I love it. You all created everything, you and 14 other people, 12 other people created everything that came in that synthesis. So that, yeah, it's so powerful to kind of come back around and reflect on it together. Um, I'm curious how, Elodie, you said that the piece that stuck out to you and hearing that out loud was just the social movement piece but I'm curious what other elements or themes in the synthesis, as you heard me read it out loud, like struck you differently, that you heard reflecting back things that you said, or that felt new but resonated with you as you heard that out loud.
Well, so a common pattern I have is people will say, "Hey, you said this thing," and I won't remember saying it at all. And the quote, I was reading ahead a little bit as you were talking. It's like, nobody owns the trees are for everybody. I'm like, oh my God, it's such a beautiful
It's
statement.
such that who could say that?
And I was like, anyway, it just like really struck me, and I was like, damn, like, yeah, that would be such a cool way to move forward and like promote that type of culture amongst all of us is like not being like of service to the trees because we're in this partnership with them where we're trying to create this outcome. But it's like having a sense of reverence, I think, can go really, really far. Um, yeah, and some other parts of it, I mean, to me, like the genetic sourcing and identifying good trees and watching good trees, like now I'm kind of getting deeper into, I guess you could say, the science and data collection of like really observing trees. And in the past, I would observe trees usually during their fruiting season in the fall. Um, and now I'm like, dang, like it's so important to actually be with the trees at all different parts of the year to really fully understand their potential, like their phenology of like when they're leafing out, their flowering patterns, their vigor, like how they're responding to different insects. And I'm just like, it's so important for, to have tree explorers that are going to different places, finding new trees, connecting with propagators. And it's like, wow, it's so important to actually have access to trees like nearby us to really learn them and get a full understanding. There's an incredible wealth of knowledge, like as just speaking to people who have been with their orchards for decades, it's just the things that they're able to observe and pick up, it's immense. And that that directly ties into nursery work, because seed sourcing is so important to intimately know the trees. We have to be working with the people that are with them all the time. And hoping that we can get people more access to be able to plant trees and observe them and support them in that. And yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, what about you, Rhiannon? What were things that struck you differently or and then excited?
I'm really interested in the conversation around we're making lots of types of trees, right? Like there's different outcomes or different, destinations, I guess, for the different types of trees from what we're saying when we need to like double tree production in this realm of like conservation and reforestation. Um, and then there's also like, farmers who want orchard trees and, a family that wants to plant three apple trees in their backyard. And like all of those people need trees. Like and I think it's been, as a small grower, a little bit of a confused process or like bumbling process to figure out like, are we doing all of that? Are we doing some of that? Um, yeah, the lettuce growing in your backyard for wholesale markets, it does feel like that sometimes. And I think it's in our experience, there is room in a small nursery for multiple different types of production. That's the diversity that we're working towards. Um, but it doesn't, like it can be more focused, right? Like we were really excited to be selling hybrid 1-year-old tiny seedlings of hybrid chestnuts to our county soil and water. They do a berry tree sale every spring. I think a lot of soil and water districts do that. Um, and they're getting all of their trees for the most part for that sale from a quite large nursery out in Western New York that certainly is selling them a tree for like $1 per stem. Um, and we can't sell them a 2-year-old beautiful chestnut from a like very special seed source for that price, but like we can dial in so that we can get like one or two types of species that we could be offering at that scale in the nursery and have that relationship with local folks. And I ran into somebody the other day who bought some of the trees for this, like from the soil and water sale. I was like, oh my gosh, I grew those trees. Like that's yeah, really exciting. And then financially, obviously, like we need to make this work for our livelihood. And so the also having 3-year-old grafted fruit trees in a 3-gallon pot for somebody to buy in June is something that we're working in to the system as well. Because it needs to be a little bit of everything, I think. So yeah, excited to hear where other people are at with yeah, figuring out scale and the diversity of markets. And yeah, are we I feel like the aggregation conversation has to be yeah, in place in order for us to meet the needs of the like those larger scale plantings. And we just the I don't think people understand when you go to a garden center how full of pesticides and fungicides every single plant is at a garden center. There's very little organic scaled nursery production of like of ornamental plants of any type of plants really. So I think we need, yeah, we need all types of organic growing of these trees for every type of market. Um, so yeah, it's just nice to see that kind of reflected back in the synthesis.
Yeah, that was a really, really common theme. And I think y'all are both getting at this need for multiple strategies, multiple different approaches. Given the needs that people have, like different tree planting needs, there's so many different ones, but also like what a nursery could actually provide. And there's this diversification, crop diversification, instead of necessarily doing a whole bunch of different things to diversify your income stream. You're just growing trees, but diversifying the ways that you offer the trees, as a way to do income differently, which is interesting because they are all different crops. It's not like growing hazelnut is the same as growing willow. So there's a like species diversification, but a funding stream diversification that feels like a big part of that conversation. And going back to something you said a little while ago, Rhiannon, that agroforestry as a field, despite being really in name relatively new, but in practice, the oldest way humans have been in partnership with growing food, and that there's a spectrum of cultivation to so-called wild. But part of the reason in our context of the United States that this is so new is so much of the woodlands that were human generated, indigenous tended agro ecosystems were cut down for the colonial timber industry, and we're recovering and reworking a lot of work that was here for millennia that's been cut down, um, but that we're for multiple reasons lagging behind some of the conversations that are happening within vegetable or livestock conversations about scale and cooperative. And I'm curious what you all think we could learn as an agro field of agroforestry from those models, and what are things that we could do differently, or like what comes up when you think about we're lagging behind, what do we need to catch up to?
I think that I mean, I guess this is maybe just like what's on my mind a lot today, but a huge difference uh between agroforestry and tree crops and like say livestock and vegetable production is that we're still learning so much. And there's so much to learn. And I think that it would be really amazing to just get so much more financial support for research orchards, genetic repositories, like active breeding projects. And that would just like immensely help the nursery industry in a lot of ways because that can help delineate agroforestry nurseries from wholesale nurseries. And there's also a huge education piece with not only people who are interested in agroforestry, but also those that are actively implementing. There's a huge education piece of like why it's so important that those specialized genetics matter. And that's another way that we're lagging behind. So a lot of it has to do with just information, and like some of that is like really long-term projects and some of that is just uh creating resources for people to share. And so I'm in the process of creating some resources as well as a couple other folks with a SARE grant. And I am writing a guidebook for chestnut growers in the Northeast, and a lot of that is a focus on genetics, partially because that's what I've been exposed to, but with chestnuts, because they're seedling orchards, there's a possibility of there being a decentralized breeding network, essentially, which how a lot of agroforestry could be. And then Sam Thayer's writing a resource about hickory oil, and Eric Tonesmeyer's writing a resource about honey locust, which is awesome because those are trees of great interest, and we need to just like understand them more as species on all the levels. So I guess like my conclusion to all of that is like it would be so amazing to have, you know, funded research projects, breeding orchards, genetic repositories that could then support a really agroforestry specific nursery industry. And it would be great if we could offer price them at price points that could work for farmers, or like have subsidies to subsidize costs for trees. And I personally, I would like, doing things at a wholesale scale makes things cheaper. I'm curious about, well, how can we do that in like a more cooperative structure where a lot of people could participate in that? Yeah.
Yeah, the Farming with Trees project, I feel like is exactly that flavor is what we need more of. I think maybe perhaps what we need more of, yeah, totally agree with everything you're saying, Elodie. Attitude also, I think, attitude adjustment perhaps for thinking about trees. Um, they're slower. They're quite slow, and they take an investment hugely of labor up front, no matter how cheap you're getting your trees for. It's a lot of work to plant trees. I think the farmer side of the Farming with Trees project and teaching farmer tree skills is really, really important for how to take care of trees. And I think so, like everyone's interested in trees. Like I don't know, maybe I'm talking to only great people, but it really seems like everybody wants to plant trees and everybody knows that trees are good, and it's not like a controversial opinion, I guess, or to sell your case that, you ought to be planting trees. But I think people also have a hard time with not getting or not wanting trees to die, and they will die when you're planting seedlings. Um, and that they, yeah, kind of require a different pace of care, like this long term, a couple times a season of really dedicated, you're gonna mulch it at least once a year, and you're gonna have to water it probably unless you have like consistent rainfall. Um, so yeah, I think both the like long-term thinking of caring for trees and also the like impermanence of like your plants are gonna die, which I think a lot of farmers have come to terms with, like the living and dying cycle of things. But I think especially when you put a tree in and you think it's going to be there forever, it can be kind of a different experience. Um, so yeah, I think the getting shifting into kind of a long-term thinking perspective with trees is also something that we need to be seeing.
That's really helpful. And just to note, even in this share back of like things we learned from the synthesis or from the interviews, we're generating new conversation, and like new questions are coming up, and we're recording this, so we're documenting the research that we're doing live, which is so cool. So I love thinking about the action steps that can come out of this. So any connection to funders out there, there were some really good solid pitches for some agroforestry research to happen. Something you all were just saying made me think of, well, just the inevitable death of some of these trees, and that this is a real tension I've experienced with trying to find customers for more bulk options for trees, and that at our nursery, we can't meet the price that a big conservation scale nursery does, of like $1 or less per tree for some of these places, but the die off for some of those trees is also pretty high. And some of the nonprofit conservation groups that I know that aren't actually in the budgets for tree planting accounting for their labor, because that's a different budget item, in the nonprofit structure. So it's cheaper to buy a bunch of really lower quality trees, plant a bunch of them, know maybe 30 to 40 to 50 or more percent will die, and just replant them the next year. And I'm I'm curious about how more agroforestry selection can also happen in partnership with conservation, because that's where these trees came from. All the native ones we're talking about were are tended, ancestrally tended, selected trees out just in the landscape. They're not bred in the same way we're talking about doing crossing and that sort of thing. But to meet that scale and the price of like high quality genetic selected trees at a scale where people can afford them, um, so that we can get more of those trees in the landscape. I don't have a really clear question, but that just feels like one of these conundrums. That's one of these bottlenecks. And I'm curious how you all think about, like, how you reflect on that and that tension of wanting to produce a lot of trees or focus your energy on some trees and figuring out the price for that, with multiple different uh, planters. Like, what are ways that you've thought about doing that, or how have you seen that done that feels effective?
I feel like for me, one of the things that I recommend the most to people is to start small and to not do large scale plantings, period. I mean, I don't know. I'm talking mostly with smaller farmers who are, um, lucky to own their land, they feel like in a lot of situations, and some people who don't own their land, so have, no real uh incentive. Well, incentive's not the right word. No, no land tenure. So planting trees feels like not on the priority list. Um, and I think we see these like really large scale plantings. Yeah, if it's happening with specifically bred varieties, then it's, these are huge financial projects. So I think the best thing that I've been able to do with growers here is just, yeah, be like, you can plant like 6 trees this spring, and that's a good place to start. And then you can afford, the sweet spot for trees being in the like 2-year range where they're like, cool, this is definitely like a hardy, sturdy seedling who's made it through one winter, but, wasn't grown in a pot with a girdled root system or something, getting in that like, yeah, 2-year-ish sweet spot of a strong seedling can make it more, yeah, it doesn't, especially when we're, like you're saying, Elodie, doing so much breeding work and like there's a lot of experimenting happening. We don't know for sure what's going to be anything, your tree could be the best at this point. Like this one seedling could end up being the best. So I think just being like encouraging about just getting started with planting trees, and that it doesn't have to be a whole big project, and it doesn't have to be like, deal with what the tree's going to look like in 50 years. In 50 years, like you're going to see this tree from ages like 1 to 25 maybe. Like, yeah, I think again, that's I guess what I'm saying before about this long-term vision and kind of attitude adjustment, that like it doesn't have to be this huge thing to plant trees. You can start small, you can do it now, you can, experiment with seedlings, with grafted stuff, with, wild collected, local ecotypes. There's so many ways to get started in a small way. Yeah, I'm sure other people who have more like large scale planting experience would have a different response to that question, but yeah.
Um, well, I can't say that I honestly remember the original question fully. But I am of the belief that I don't usually tend to be like large scale only or small scale only. I tend to be, these days I'm more involved with projects that are more large scale minded, although that wasn't always the case. Um, I think that it takes what's that saying that people say? It's just like it takes all kinds. Like I think that there's benefits to all these different strategies. Um, and that it is unfortunate that usually how it works is those with access to more capital can do larger scale things and, have a larger amount of momentum. Me personally, I don't own land, I'm kind of like affiliated with a lot of things, but I don't have my own agroforestry planting. So um, I can understand that a lot. So I try to find the ways that I can participate in that. And that's been nursery work is huge. Um, I love collecting and seeds and observing trees as well. And that would be so cool to like actually have trainings on that. I've been fortunate enough to be working part-time at the Harvard Forest in Western Massachusetts, and they do all this amazing like phenology research and like just been like learning so much about how to like look at trees and all the surprising things about them, and also just through kind of the old guard of the Northern Nut Growers Association. I learned so much from those people. And yeah, it would just be amazing to even just train people on how to look at trees. I seem to keep like talking about that today. But I guess that is all to say, do you mind repeating the original question, maybe?
What you said was exactly on point. I think that's so helpful of just like multiple approaches to this. And the question was more of just like meeting that scale at a cost that is affordable when it might just be cheaper for some organizations to buy cheap trees and then know they're going to die and plant them the next year. And so that is kind of more of like where I'm coming from with that question.
Yeah, and also to build upon that of like, gosh, it's like sometimes I hear people buying seed from like really large scale seed companies or like these really big wholesale companies. It's like they're the cheaper trees, but it's like, but the genetics, it's like it's really worth the investment. Like these are gonna, if you're trying to get trees that live 50, 100, 200 years old, it's like it's definitely worth the initial investment, although some might not be able to do that on a large scale. So it's like, how do we really convey that to people and be like, show them how much of a big difference that is? And also, how do we support people being able to make that investment is huge. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing to flag maybe for later is like trainings on seed selection and also like getting seeds out, not just the trees, but the seeds to people, which there are amazing agroforestry nurseries doing that. But make that more cooperatively held and coordinated would be amazing. Um, there's so many directions to go, but you both talked about this big piece of land tenure, of like land ownership or the lack of it. That everybody was thinking about farming and many other ways, the cost of housing, but just like land, the access and affordability of land is huge. But you're both involved in agroforestry efforts that are thinking and farming efforts that are thinking creatively about land tenure and stewardship. So I'm curious if you could talk about the connection you see between those models of land tenure and agroforestry, and is there a role that nurseries could play in that relationship between alternative land tenure and long-term agroforestry?
Something that is brought up a lot in agroforestry is, well, the basic definition of it is usually there's a diversified income stream. So there's like multiple crops that you're managing within one system. And often the conclusion that people come to is like, well, I'm going to plant an orchard and then I'm going to find a partner to graze sheep in that orchard. Or it's like people are starting to think about different partnerships that they could form with people. Um, there's ways that people are growing trees in ground that could be totally compatible as like an alley crop within an orchard system. And that sounds really exciting as maybe like one avenue if someone was thinking something a little bit larger scale. But on the other hand of that, there's a lot of the reason these smaller scale nurseries are popping up is because you don't need that land access as much. And, you can grow thousands of trees in a small space, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so compelling. Um, but yeah, I think it would also be really cool to support nursery people to develop relationships with existing orchards. There's a fun little thing about how you can sell seed for way more than the actual crop that you grow. So if you know of orchards in your area, that have some good genetics, you could maybe develop a relationship of like, hey, I'd love to observe your trees more closely. And we can figure out a deal where this is advantageous for both of us, where you can maybe get seed for a little cheaper and the farmer actually able to sell it more per pound. So that's an interesting way to gain land access as well. But of course, that depends on where you're located. And then, of course, there's just like trees in the landscape, like in people's front and backyards that, they'll just give it to you for free. Sometimes they're so happy that you do it, you'd almost wonder if you should be charging them for it. So. And also I would really encourage people of looking through the Northern Nut Growers Association archives, and you can find old nut plantings and like really exceptional genetics that way as well. So that's kind of how I've been able to have access to trees and land, is kind of a lot that way. I haven't explored doing outlet cropping and nursery trees, but I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
We're right on the same page. We're excited to be working with some apple orchards near us, to be collecting scion just for, normal named varieties, but also like a neighbor within, 20 minutes of us, like some wild apple trees on his property that he's been making cider with and is especially excited about. So yeah, I think there's, infinite variations of that for wherever you are. There's going to be some special tree nearby that either is specifically stewarded or not. There's a lot of material for the taking out there. I'll speak quickly to the West Branch Commons project that I mentioned as well. There is a third generation dairy farm here in Delaware County that has a aging operator who doesn't have any heirs, and so this project has blossomed out of a desire from his name's Tom, to keep the land in production. And so we're transitioning it, a really amazing community group, a bunch of different partner organizations working together to make it into a community land trust that will be able to have multiple farms on it long term. It'll be run by its own nonprofit, and that nonprofit will then offer long-term leases, in potentially in like the 99-year lease sort of category, but also potentially shorter leases that would still be considered long-term in ag, like a 20-year lease perhaps, and hopefully beginning farmer training as well. I got involved with that project right away because it's so exciting. I as a trees are multi-generational people, so I think anybody who's doing an orchard, like, you have to be thinking about the next generation from the get-go. Like, it's going to be better once you're gone. So the thought of putting in so much love and labor into something that potentially might not have a new generation to take it over, yeah, it's kind of a requirement, I would say, of doing agroforestry, is multi-generational thinking. So I was like, yeah, there's a agrarian commons project. It needs trees for sure. So I've been excited to be on we're a working board. We're meeting weekly we need to raise quite a lot of money, close to $1 million, to buy that property and get the organization off the ground. So it's been a beautiful, deep relationship type project, with a pretty intimate team at this point. And yeah, it's exciting to see that there could be, yeah, some sort of, like we're talking here, like genetic repository, long-term, forever protected, sort of tree space there. Yeah. So there's probably a project similar to you, if wherever you are, of people trying to get cooperative access to land, affordable access to land. So I think it's the case for a lot of things. If you actually go looking, it might feel like no one else is doing it, but when you look, everyone else seems to be doing it.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of like hearing a new word, and then all of a sudden you hear it everywhere. In the next few weeks, I feel like trees can be that way. Like, I just learned how to ID that tree. Now it's everywhere. But then, like, all the cool agroforestry or land projects, once you recognize them, there are a lot of cool things. So how do we coordinate them and collaborate with them? And this theme that we're talking about, just to note again, there's the multi-generational land stewardship session through Ask An Agroforester. And then I think earlier this year or last year, there was one on cooperative land ownership that I think involved the Black Family Land Trust and then Cooperate WNC in what in North Carolina. So some awesome resources out there about this really crucial conversation is if we're going to plant trees, who's taking care of them long term, and who has access and determination for the trees and their lives. Um, we're
Yeah.
gonna open it up. Go ahead, Rhiannon, you got something?
I mean, yeah, just to say that the trees kind of force that train of thought when that train of thought is appropriate for any organizing that we're doing. Like we always need to have long-term vision, and thought about how, beyond tomorrow, how does this thing stand? So I, yeah, just appreciate that that's the frame of reference that trees put us into.
Yeah. Orientation to the past too, the genetic inheritance of the seeds, and the cuttings themselves kind of put us in a really interesting time zone with the trees in the present moment with that orientation. I want to ask you all one more question and then open it up. And Emily, if you've got questions coming up that you want to ask, and we got two from participants that I'll bring up, but uh, the last one that I'll ask for now is what project in your nursery or in the tree crop, research that you're doing, are you feel most excited about when you get into or you think about? Are they species or are they a connection that you're making? But what's got you animated right now about the work that you're doing?
I am falling in love with willow, and all fodder adjacent plants. We planted we were at the nursery, Jonathan, at the beginning of April. The difference between now and then from how that willow block looks is enormous. We just planted, talk about, Elodie, you mentioned like somebody else gave this to me for free, this knowledge, this helping. I was gifted a massive volume of willow cuttings from a farmer a couple of years ago, and I'm, yeah, now at the point of having a yeah, not enormous, but feels pretty big willow block, of all different basketry varieties, and then some that are like native local selections, wild selections from other basket makers, in the Catskills. And we were doing hybrid poplars, things like that that are really easy to establish. I think that's why I'm most excited about them in this context of, agroforestry, tree people. Cuttings are easily, the least expensive way to get a system going. And so, I mean, there's lots of things. There's the elderberries and the currants and lots of food producing, human food producing species that can do that as well. And so I guess, yeah, I'm excited about all of the fruit generally, but I would say, yeah, as a little side blip, the willows and poplars and anything that could be ruminant fodder are really exciting.
I guess what is feeling really alive for me right now is yeah, it's just been kind of the theme of what's on my mind today and what's been on my mind lately. Through this grant opportunity through the Northern Nut Growers Association, going down and mapping and observing the trees at Sleeping Giant, I'm really just getting started. They're hybrid chestnuts, and I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear earlier. Um, and chestnuts have a lot of focus in the agroforestry field right now. I love chestnuts. I think I have a deeper fondness for other trees, but it's so interesting that um that when you're able to actually really observe them at their different stages, it's just amazing the things that you learn about them, like the nature of them and how and the you really get into like the details of why a tree is special or maybe not. Like why it's like interesting that people focused on this tree. It doesn't really seem to be that good. And then you're like, but wait, there's all these other trees kind of in the background that this tree is amazing and no one's paid attention to it. And so I think that that's what's feeling really alive for me. I see it so connected with nursery work, because we'll be able to really ensure people that they're getting good stuff, which is so important. And would be so great to actually share those observations with people in the way, and so that then they can report back to you how their trees are doing and things that they've noticed. And yeah, so I don't know. I'm like really wanting, not only do I want to get on a piece of land long term, but I'm really feeling the need of like getting people, like helping people get access to that long term to develop those relationships. Um, and yeah, just trying to figure out avenues of how research could work. And currently, I'm exploring the idea of combining green burial with genetic repository or breeding orchards. And that's been an interest of mine for several years. And I'm just starting to talk about it more with people, but it's an idea if that should be explored. And it varies a lot state by state, but that is kind of, it's not exactly commons because it's like owned by the nonprofit that, but there's potential to have things protected in perpetuity in that way. And it's also like can create such beautiful meaning for people and how they want to deal with in their afterlife. So yeah, that's something that I feel excited about right now. And maybe hopefully that can be a possibility for us to actually establish genetic repositories.
It resonates so much after talking with Eliza Greenman, who's been on this webinar and was one of the interviewees for this project. She talked about green cemeteries, like natural burial sites, as perfect tree crop repositories. So I went to visit the one that's 7 miles from our nursery and had an awesome conversation with the new family member who's caretaking, who was an archaeologist who's really excited in conservation and was already planting native trees. And so we haven't been able to continue because there's some family decision-making processes that they have to go through, but they were really excited about that vision. And a very dear friend and neighbor who died last week was just buried or planted in that green burial. So it'd be a really beautiful way to stay in relationship. And I also get really excited about the support trees, the willows and the hybrid poplars too. Chestnuts and hazelnuts and elderberries and persimmons get a lot of attention, as they rightly should. But I also think there's so many, especially native trees, that could be the support trees in our agroforestry system. We're doing cottonwood and sycamore, biomass production, both of which grow from cuttings, and false indigo is a nitrogen fixer that grows from seed and cuttings. So I get pretty excited about those too, in ways that rival the excitement for chestnut for some reason. But
Yeah,
yeah,
just
go
want to
ahead.
echo that of like how important those species are for like
Yeah,
biodiversities in our system. Insanely important. Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Black cherry is like a keystone species in the eastern woodlands that's popping up everywhere. So I'm just incorporating pollarded black cherry more into our systems because of how much Lepidoptera species they feed. And the fruit's really good. It was called mountain rum cherry in these parts because people made a drink with it. It's really tasty.
That was a big thing from the farmer listening session report back, was that it's a huge area of interest amongst like veg farmers is pollinator habitat and
Yeah.
like windbreaks to stop pesticide drift and things that, as people who are specifically interested in agroforestry for tree crops maybe aren't connecting the dots with as much, but there's, yeah, enormous interest amongst farmers for those ecosystem services. It came out of my mouth and I was like, I don't like that. It's a little capitalist for my preferred
We can
framework,
call we can call them gifts.
but yes.
Yeah, the gift economy. Yeah, I love naming that because that might lower the barrier of entry for some people who get so intimidated, like I have been with breeding, is also thinking about
Yeah.
all the native tree crops that are cropped through biomass and pollination and ecological life support. All that stuff is just as critical. And speaking of native trees, I'll shift here in the last 10 minutes there. We got two questions that came through, and then after those, Emily, I'll pass it back to you. One person said that they know yellowbud has butternut seedlings. In our circles, do we know anybody else who's working with butternuts and specifically on developing a canker-resistant butternut? And I'll start with that just real quick and say we offer butternut in our nursery from several trees that are growing here. One of which is a big tree on the river that is, as far as I can tell, canker-free. Another one is at least 80 years old that shows some signs of canker, but is still cropping abundantly on the mass cycle every 2 or 3 years. But there's a lot of research that I've seen, I think in Indiana, that it rings a bell to you all, but I think Indiana University or something like that has been doing butternut research, but see if you all have a response to that too.
Uh, I've I've kind of dabbled. Well, so this is interesting. There's a site that I'm connected to in the Hudson Valley that was very widely propagated by these two guys, Benton and Smith. And one of the things they really worked on was Bwart nuts, which is a horrible name, but they're butternut heartnut hybrids. But anyway, so I've observed and collected from those trees, which is very cool. And I was able to, there were a few trees in the landscape that I was like, man, this tree is so vigorous and healthy, and it looks like a pure butternut. And I was actually able to test them. There was a researcher, gosh, I can't remember which university he was affiliated with. I guess this deserves some context of like butternut and Japanese walnuts or heart nuts. They hybridize readily in the environment. So sometimes what looks like a very healthy, pure butternut actually, and they're more common than you think, can have Japanese walnut genetics in there. That is to say, is that a bad thing? Depending on the context, it might not have to be a pure butternut, but there's a lot of really healthy hybrids out there that are super productive and very vigorous. So that's something to consider. Yellowbud Farm, I don't know fully what entails their latest offerings. I don't think that they're focusing on butternut trees. But there is a really interesting block of canker-resistant butternuts at the Lockwood Farm in Connecticut, um, which is very close and affiliated with the Sleeping Giant orchard that I'm visiting. So if people were interested in that seed, I might be happy to facilitate that. And also Buzz Fervor, I believe, does grow those butternuts. Buzz Fervor of Perfect Circle Farm. So that is a little repository there, canker-resistant butternuts.
Beautiful. Let's get those, share those genetic resources and get those green burial sites planted with some butternuts too. Tie some threads together here. One more question for you all that was dropped in was, is there any website or organization like Izel Plants, IZEL, which I'm not familiar with, but any website like Izel Plants, which educates consumers and aggregates nursery offerings of trees and shrubs? Not that I know of, other than like something like Fedco, but it's a little different. But I'm wondering if you all have any insight.
I've seen, um, if you get into the world of like nursery and greenhouse trade associations, there can be, you know, uh, yeah, information about what nurseries exist out there, but that's more in the like wholesale type nurseries. Um, Edible Acres, Sean Dombrowski has a great resource page on his website that has a lot of agroforestry type nurseries listed. Um, and the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. Elodie, I don't know if you have any information on the status of nursery aggregation that they might be interested in, but I think, yeah, one of my hopes for like a continuation of this project is that we can continue to talk about aggregation amongst smaller scale nurseries. It's going to take a lot of work, I think, to get on the same page about pricing and grading and finding good markets. Anybody who's doing an aggregation project from many small farms, there's like a lot of, yeah, work and training for those growers to be, having consistent practices. And so I would love to see it happen. I would be happy to, yeah, supply labor to such an effort. But to my knowledge, I don't know that there's anybody doing a lot of aggregation of plant material specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think like kind of the education piece of that question. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up the question. I keep pulling up in the chat. Um, yeah, educating consumers. I mean, I think there's a lot of different resources out there. I think part of the work that I'm doing is to try and get uh more in-depth information to be more accessible. And the resources I'm creating through the SARE grant that I mentioned earlier, my hope is just to, at first I was trying to think of big ideas of like, should I put this on a platform or something? And I'm like, I think I'm just going to make these into a PDF and reach out to a bunch of organizations like Farming with Trees and just try to get them in as many places as possible. And like, hopefully nurseries can have those resources on their websites as well. And so they'll be free resources. I wish that we had kind of more a centralized location for information and in a way where people were, actually had paid positions where they were managing that. So that's another need.
You're gonna find some good niches for things in this conversation, so that's stuff to keep building on, which I really appreciate. Um, I'm gonna pass it back over to Emily, but thank you all, Elodie, Rhiannon, so much. Hopefully it's abundantly clear to everybody why we wanted to interview them, but also invite them for this conversation. But I have so much appreciation for both of you and the work that you do and the way that you do it, the spirit with which you do it. Just so excited to keep collaborating, and thanks for joining this.
Yeah, and just what Elodie was saying, I just want to dovetail into one last question. Just are there any like educational resources or spaces that you want to kind of shout out or uplift? Obviously, NNGA has gotten mentioned several times, which totally agree with. I went for the first time last year, and I was just like, this is definitely the most useful conference I've ever been to in terms of just like the depth and like of targeted information. Um, and also just like people up like till all hours of the night, like still talking about trees. It was really fun and a really very like specific group of folks who were just like deeply invested. And I like that the thread kept coming up about the types of people that are working on these projects and in these spaces are necessarily people who are invested in like multi-generational land stewardship and multi-generational efforts. And what does that mean? Um, but are there any, I think as someone coming into this space, it can be really intimidating, especially because hear from folks like you or like go to an event like NNGA and it's like these people know so much. I don't like how do I get there? And there I it can be really hard to find good information about some of these very niche things. So, is there anything you want to just like shout out while you have a moment to do that? Because I know that there are resources out there that are often like overlooked or just people aren't aware of.
The first thing that comes to mind for me, which is probably not a stranger resource to most of you, but the National Agroforestry Center out of the USDA has any information that you could ever want about agroforestry. There's like a list of every SARE grant that's ever been applied for or awarded that has agroforestry as a topic. There's tons and tons of PDFs. So yeah, tons of free resources available that way. It can feel like a fire hose kind of situation. So on the other end of the spectrum, I would recommend that folks try to find a local chapter of your National Young Farmers Coalition. Even if you are not a young farmer, I've never talked to anybody at a National Young Farmers Coalition chapter that has said that they truly only allow young farmers in their in their organizing. Um, yeah, it's just a way to talk to individuals and have those like on the ground conversations about how it's actually playing out for people in real time, and whether or not I'm sure there's going to be somebody who's doing something agroforestry directly related or adjacent at your local chapter, and if there isn't a local chapter, you could start one, and there's similar adjacent types of organizations like here in Western New York. There is a group that kind of broke off from the National Young Farmers Coalition because of that age thing to become the Good Farmers Guild of Western New York. So I think any sort of like local farmer affinity groups, even if it's just like purely for social gathering and stuff like you're talking about, Emily, it like really makes a big difference when you can connect the thousands of pages of PDFs that you can find available online with an actual human being who has an experience.
Those are great. Thank you.
Someone that comes to mind that I think is super knowledgeable and a great author and is accessible. Eric Tonesmeyer has written some really incredible resources. Not only his books, but he kind of a recent one where it was a real focus on fodder species. And a lot of his personal research right now is in fodder species. So sometimes he'll even have like different workshops that come up. So I really recommend checking him out. He is working with Interlace Commons to create a resource on alley cropping, which is really exciting. Um, yeah, I just think that also it's just like as many like in-person opportunity meetups as you can go to. I would really recommend that, and even webinars like this. And there is stuff like this is such a cool series, by the way, and like I think it's huge because I think that this series itself it'll help point people in a certain direction. So yeah, this is great. But
Thanks.
sorry to get like kind of uh incestuous in that way, but I feel like this is awesome because you're getting people who have kind of been in it and really just talking about it. Yeah.
Jonathan, anything you want to add?
Second, all those. There's, I don't watch a lot of YouTube channels, but I know that there's some really good ones out there that people could follow up on and learn. I've really appreciated Akiva Silver's book, Trees of Power. I think it's a really accessible intro to propagation. But one that I do a lot of research with, like when I write our plant descriptions for our website that try to be like uh, as like detailed as possible about social and cultural and ecological relationships and not just like the crop of the tree, but the Native American ethnobotany database is kind of a collection of all these historic research on different indigenous nations across Turtle Island, across what's called the United States, and their relationship with native trees and other things. So there's tons of information, like historic information there, which is fascinating to look at.
All right, we will leave it there. Thanks so much, Jonathan, Rhiannon, Elodie. Really a pleasure to get to sit back and listen to y'all today. I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure everybody else did too. Um, and that closes up our spring season. We'll see y'all in the fall. If anyone has, hot topics they'd love to present on or hear about, please reach out to me. Very much open to suggestions. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.